Thank you. I'm Steve. I'm here to moderate, and my closest relation is having read these to my children. So I would like to ask our panelists to give a short introduction of themselves and tell us a little bit about their take on either Milne or Potter or both.
Okay.
Start with that.
Well, my name is Dan Wells. I am a writer. I write grisly, horrific horror fiction, so obviously I'm on the Beatrix, Potter, and A.A. Milne. Honestly, I'm here because A.A. Milne is one of my top 2 favorite authors of all time. I have read the Winnie the Pooh stuff, and I like it, but the Christopher Robin poems, I have virtually memorized most of. I love them. I've read to the point of destroying 2 different copies of the book, and then the 3rd copy of the book I couldn't find when I searched for it frantically all week long. So it's probably still in a storage unit somewhere from when we moved. But big fan.
My name is Candace Thomas. I write young adult fantasy, and we're like twins because it's exactly how I feel about A.A. Milne. He kind of changed my life, and it's the poems that really spoke to me. And I just love A.A. Milne.
I'm Jaclyn Weist. I write young adult fantasy as well. Actually, I have a middle grade fantasy series with Mikey about Atlantis. And I love A.A. Milne as well. Eeyore is my favorite. Anything with Eeyore, I want. So he's my favorite.
I'm Mikey Brooks. I'm an author illustrator. I deal primarily in children's books, so picture books up to middle grade. I think these 2 authors kind of have the mindset that I have. I like to tell stories to kids, and I remember growing up with Winnie the Pooh and Peter Cottontail and all the different stuff that these 2 authors did, and it's fun because now I have little kids and I get to introduce these characters to them and hopefully have them get a love of reading stories from that.
Let me toss out a question, and we'll start with Mikey, come backwards this way, and maybe we'll respond to it. So our panel is subtitled Fantasy for the Very Young. And aside from, children's fiction generically often has anthropomorphic non-humans. Go a little beyond that and draw for me why Potter or Milne, aside from the anthropomorphic non-humans, can be characterized as fantasy.
Why they're fantasy?
Yeah. How does it draw to...
Well,
draw me a line from that to...
Well, you look at Christopher Robin, who goes out and his stuffed animals become real, and that's a fantastical element. It's magic. They become, and you see that with little kids too. They have their toys and their stuffed animals, and in their imaginary world, the magic happens where those creatures become real to them. And that's exactly what they're doing here. And then, not to mention that it's, you have the animals wearing clothes and all that brings in a fantastical element to it. But I think it's all, imagination is fantasy, and that's all what these are about, is the child's imagination.
I absolutely love Calvin and Hobbes for the same reason. He has his little tiger come to life. All ultimate. I always wanted a Calvin, and I got 6 and a husband. And but I agree. They have these little animals that come to life. If I watch my 4-year-old daughter, she does the same thing. She feeds her teddy bears or whatever else right next to her. It's just magic. It brings people. It lets them forget everything and remember. And see a bear that loves honey and a rabbit that's psycho
He's just grumpy.
And a grumpy little donkey who doesn't think anybody cares about him. But it's just magic. And so that's to me what brings the fantasy. Same with Peter Cottontail. You get to see the rabbit side of the story instead of the farmer side of the story. Instead of dang rabbit, stay out of my field, it's the other side.
It's hard to, I echo everything you say. It's hard to go away from the imagination of it. I think the true magic is how we feel about it and how it makes us go back to regressing on how we felt about our animals going to life and the fantasy about that. I think that's where the true magic is.
One of the things that I love about Milne is, that there are some poems where he presents the child's play directly as imagination. There's the poem where Christopher Robin is just in his room, and like every line he's pretending to be a new thing, and then the chorus is roundabout and roundabout and roundabout I go, and that's how my kids play. They just run in circles and pretend to be a different thing every 5 minutes. But then there's others where something incredible will happen, and it's presented as if it were completely normal. And I think that's one of the genius things that Milne does, is kind of the magic of the mundane. There's not a wizard there doing something, but there's a whole poem about Pooh falling out of the window of the nursery, and the King of France comes and meets him on the street, and they have a little conversation, and then he sends him back in the house. And that's totally real, and it's not presented as an imagination thing, nor is it presented as a really cool thing. It's just, are you, sir, by any chance, His Majesty the King of France? And, it's this wonderful little fantasy that happens that doesn't have to be big and momentous the way adults demand their fantasy to be. It's just this cute little thing, and it happens, and it's great, and then we move on.
One of the things that goes along with that for me, I may have a low sense for rhythm and humor and whatnot, but my favorite is James Morrison.
Morrison, movie George Dupree.
Took great care of his mother. But he was only...
Could you speak loudly enough that it comes past the table?
James Morrison, Weatherby George Dupree, took great care of his mother, though he was only 3. And so the poem goes on, and again, just as with Pooh's adventure, James is looking for his mother, who's gone down to the end of the town and not come back with him, and King John puts up a reward for her. Lost or stolen or strayed.
James Morrison's mother seems to have been mislaid.
So, let's jump from that a little bit to a little bit scarier thing, and we'll start with our scary man, Dan, here. Because as I've been sitting here thinking about the fantastic elements, it also strikes me that there is an element, a real element in Peter Cottontail, and in the Winnie the Pooh stories, a real danger element. There is a threat. There is a risk factor.
Oh yeah, I remember.
Tell us about that.
So I'm going to start the story actually by talking about Neil Gaiman. When the Graveyard book came out a few years ago, he was on the Colbert Show, and Colbert started out by saying the first sentence of your book is, "The hand in the shadows held a knife." Is this really what our kids need to be reading? Why can't they read nice stuff like Peter Rabbit? And, Gaiman kind of brushed it off and said something nice. Meanwhile, I'm screaming at the TV, have you ever actually read Peter Rabbit? That is a story about a child from a broken home who breaks into his neighbor's house, and the neighbor tries to kill him and eat him. Yeah. That is dark as crap. And that's Beatrix Potter, for crying out loud. And there's actually a lot of darkness in a lot of her stuff, much more so than Milne. But there is that kind of undercurrent, and the way it's presented, it's never, oh no, run. There's no real gritty tension in the story of Peter Rabbit, and yet, it's there, it's under the surface, and as kids we all grew up reading that. And I can't remember what your question was.
I'm looking for his responses to the Jeopardy.
Yeah.
I'm kind of perplexed. I don't know exactly how to
follow that up. Okay, well then let's talk about Milne again. And you look at the Winnie the Pooh stories, and there is a strong sense of danger constantly, but it's not physical danger. It's, I guess the bees. But for the most part, it's, I am very small and alone. I mean, that's what Piglet's whole character role is to be the one who's small and scared of things. And each one of the Winnie the Pooh characters kind of stand in for, this is, you know, something that children want, or this is something that children do, or this is something that children are afraid of. And so you kind of see those, you know, issues that are, you know, a child is not, I think about my 3-year-old, he is not scared of zombies, and he's not scared of monsters. He's scared of being abandoned. He doesn't want to be alone upstairs when I'm downstairs, and then all of a sudden he realizes he's alone and he gets terrified. And that's what scares kids, and those are the kind of scares that you see in the Winnie the Pooh stories.
That makes sense. The books, for me, when I read them when I was younger, helped me conquer certain aspects of you know, my fears of, you know, like being alone, or you know, being in the dark. You know, I wanted, you know, things around me all the time. Those kind of things. I see that a lot in other young adult literature, or you know, children's literature, where it tries to teach children to be brave and to face, you know, certain things that they don't on a day-to-day basis really face.
And really kind of softballs that message. You know, you look at some of the, especially the recent Disney Winnie the Pooh stuff, and they get way too overt with the, you know, you can be brave, don't worry. Whereas in the original stories, it was much more subtle. So I'm going to tell you a cool story, and without beating you over the head with it, you're going to come out the other end smarter. And you know, some of the other dark elements, I mean, we talked about Eeyore. Eeyore is a fantastic way of introducing children to sadness and depression. And you know, Eeyore and Charlie Brown are the only two major children's characters I can think of that deal with those issues. And you know, you watch something like, you know, as much as I love Calvin and Hobbes, or some of these other children's properties, you see kids who are constantly happy and constantly energetic. And you know, it's important that there are stories that people like my brother could read growing up, where, oh, here's a character who's more like me, who wants to be quiet, doesn't want to run around, and doesn't want to be shouting all the time. And maybe I'm really sad right now, and that's okay, because so is Eeyore and so is Charlie Brown.
That's kind of where I was going to go with it too. I think everybody has fears, and if you have those books and everything else that only show the happy, the kids are never going to relate to it. But if they see, oh look, he's scared of this, or he's scared of this, just like me, they're gonna want to read more about that character to see how they fight it. And you keep everything hunky-dory, that's just not how life is. And you know, as far as the Winnie the Pooh, they keep it light, but it still teaches those same things. And it's important for kids to see the good and the bad, because they're gonna have sad days. They're gonna have days when they feel alone, and you need to have books like these that can teach them how to feel better, or someone else feels this way, so I'm not the only one. Because you don't want to be alone, just like he said about his son. They don't want to be alone. They want to have someone right there. And, you know, I have a son who won't shut the door when he wants to go to the bathroom, because he wants to know that everybody's around there, and he won't go downstairs without the rest of us, because he wants to know that we're right there. And so something like this would be great for him, because then he can say, okay, this is who I am, and this is who I can relate to.
I like everything that's been said. I've been enjoying it. But I was thinking of something when, I don't know if kids really pick up on the things in stories like adults do. They don't see Peter Rabbit as a scary story. I mean, one of my daughter's favorite books, and she's 5, and she loves this movie, I don't know why, because it freaks me out, is Where the Wild Things Are. And it's creepy. They're like monsters ripping each other's arms off and trying to eat this little boy, and she thinks it's the greatest thing in the world, and because she doesn't see the scariness behind it. And I don't think kids really pick up on that as much as they do the things that they relate with being left alone. You know, the things that they fear now, like us adults, where we can look at it and say, oh, it's kind of scary, because we can look at a lot of stories as adults and see how scary they are, really.
You know, it occurs to me as we're talking about this kind of depiction of fear that, you know, Piglet and a few of these other characters are really some of the only ones who are presented as being afraid, and it's not funny and it's not bad. And you look at adult fiction, and who are the classic cowards of adult fiction? We have maybe Falstaff from Shakespeare, we have Scooby-Doo and Shaggy, who are kind of defined by being afraid of things, and they're all played for laughs. We're supposed to laugh at them because they're afraid. And children are allowed to be afraid. Piglet's scared, and no one says, buck up, It's just Pooh says, don't worry, well, I'm here with you. And then we move on. And, I think that kind of acceptance is really valuable.
It strikes me too, listening to what you say. I wonder, when we read these things in it, and we talk a lot at this symposium about the things that come into your story when you write it that you didn't think to put in it. And the stories don't read to me like anyone intended to teach a lesson about fear or anything else. They were writing about character. They were writing characters in a setting, going through a plot. Does this sound familiar? And yet, because they are real people, that's why we can respond to that.
Definitely.
I want to, it's a little traditionally early now, but I would like to open it up to see if anyone came with a question or two for us before we go on our own conversational path. It's 7 o'clock, isn't it?
Everyone's too tired.
Almost 20
And
minutes.
we're talking about bedtime stories.
Yeah, really.
What were you thinking?
Okay, so I want to throw another one out at you, just because it's fun and because everyone on this panel a parent?
I think so.
I think we've all done this. Talk to me about the experience of reading these books aloud or hearing them read to you aloud. Mikey.
Well, I have to do the voices right. My wife can't do voices, so she doesn't get to read very often because the girls won't let her. It's fun when you see a kid get it. When you're reading something. I have really young kids. I have 3 girls, 1, 3, and a 5-year-old. And we read every single night for about a half an hour, and we read different stories. But it's interesting when you read them a story and they understand the concept, it kind of makes you excited as a parent. But when their facial expressions is what really does it for me. But yeah, I don't know what else to say.
I love reading stories to my kids, but it's the same at my house. Dad does a much better job than Mom. And you've got the don't let the pigeon drive the bus. That's my daughter's favorite. It's because she can interact. They ask her and she said, no, you can't. And I think it makes a big difference. And the more you read, the more excited they get and the more they want to keep reading. And I can tell a couple of the kids that I kind of failed a little bit more on with reading, because as they got older, they're not quite as excited about books, and maybe it's just because they haven't found the series that they really want to read. But I read Percy Jackson one night, read 1 chapter, and my son, who wouldn't read anything, stole the book out of my hand, went downstairs and read the whole thing by himself, and finished the entire series because he found something that spoke to him, and he loved it. And if I try to get him to read a book, he won't read it. But if he picks out the book, he will devour it. Harry Potter, I tried for 3 years to try and get him to read it, and it finally took him picking it up himself. He's like, Mom, these are anything like the movies. I'm like, oh, I'm telling you that. But I think reading stories to the kids are the same thing. It teaches them about different worlds, and things that we relate to in those books are going to not be quite the same as what they relate to, and you may not even think about a book really hitting them, but to them it's that most important, and you'll know that because they'll keep bringing that same book back every time because there's something in it that they absolutely adore. And for my little girl right now, it's all the German books from my husband because it's a different language, and she can interact and she's learning a lot more and she's picking up some German on the way, which is really cool. But it's just fun to see how into a story they can get.
Okay, so I'm a writer. It's ingrained in me. And A.A. Milne was really important to me in helping establish my my imagination. And so I felt it very important that I read the Winnie the Pooh and the poems to my kids, because I really wanted them to understand the imagination that was and the craft that was in there, especially the poems, because I remember my high school teacher said there's no good rhyming poems, and I said, you are wrong. You're so wrong, because have you not read these books? You know, they're just, the way that he writes it is just like sweet milk and honey, because it just comes so naturally, the cute rhythms and the rhymes of it, and I just wanted that so badly to be in part of my kids' raising how they were raised. You know, I don't want them to miss that at all. I want them to be able to pick that out when they get old. That, oh yeah, I remember, you know, little boy kneels at the foot of his bed, droops on his little hand, let's go ahead. You know, I just loved those poems, and they just, it was just really important to me as a parent that I pass that on.
But I would like a little bit of butter for my bread. Okay, the ones who have read the poems.
But you must admit, there is a lot of bad rhyming poetry out there too.
Well, yeah,
Oh, there's a lot of really bad rhyming. I've actually made.
I'm not disputing
I
that.
agree with you though, and I've actually made this argument to an English professor at one point, that if Milne had been writing for adults instead of kids, he'd be recognized as one of the great poets of English. Mm-hmm. But no, he was writing for kids, and they rhymed, so screw you. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that one of the main reasons I became an author is because I read the Christopher Robin poems as a kid, and you know, reading them out loud, because there's such an amazing sense of play. He is not just writing, he is playing with words, and when you read them, you know, it's so perfectly constructed, like you were saying, the rhythm and the rhyme and everything. I mean, it's something as simple as, John has great big waterproof boots on. John has a great big waterproof hat. John has a great big waterproof Macintosh, and that, says John, is that. That, he just controlled my mind from like 150 years ago. That's amazing. He got me into this very specific thing. He controlled the way that I spoke those words out loud.
Yep.
And that's brilliant. And so few poets can do that. And he did it for 3-year-olds, which is like a miracle. So, hooray.
I have no sense of rhythm, except when I'm reading Milne. It also strikes me, I don't think there are 5 human beings on the earth who fondly remember any of the plays he wrote for adults. Because Milne was a playwright in London's East End, and nobody puts on his plays anymore. Let's explore this a little more, because particularly a large part of the panel, this half, is really taken with the poetry of Milne. Mm-hmm. And I want to hear from you guys again, but I want to start at that end. As writers, I want you two to talk to me about the influence of Milne's poetry or poetic leanings on his prose. Tell me how you feel about his prose as far as rhythm and so on.
I feel like I just jumped back to English class.
7 o'clock.
Here's my oral essay. I don't know how to answer that question. I think it was interesting. You're talking about influence, and several of you said that he's influenced you as writers, and it's interesting to look at those writers that influenced him. Like James Barrie, who would be a good one to have on this panel, with having the Peter Pan books that he was very influenced by. I don't know, I think I don't know how his poetry influenced his prose.
You can call it a throwaway question, we can move on.
Yeah.
I'm trying.
How his poetry influenced his own prose? Is that the question?
Sure.
Yeah.
It was where I went, but I don't know if
Yeah.
it went anywhere.
I mean, well, the great thing about poetry is what it teaches you more than anything else is economy of language. Like the John had great big waterproof boots on that I just said. Part of the reason that works is because it slowly steps up from brutal monosyllables to the phrase waterproof Macintosh. And that is what, it's not just what he's talking about, but the very specific words that he is choosing and the order he is putting them in changes the feel and changes everything. And once you learn how to do that in poetry, it can't help but infect your writing. And I have to assume that his stories would not be nearly as beloved or remembered if he had not learned that economy of language from poetry.
See, I don't remember his stories for his words. I remember it from the characters, and I think that's where we differ. And maybe that's where he was saying he saw it kind of divided, because I don't remember the poetry, even though I like poetry, but I don't remember it or can recite. I know some of it, but I think it was the characters that he came up with that I attached myself with or influenced me more than the actual words.
Mm-hmm.
I have to say the same thing. And I still remember things here and there, but it's the characters. It's what each one of those characters stood for and what they meant to me. And like I said, I love Eeyore, but I love the friendship between Pooh and Piglet. Totally surprised my husband the other day because he had never heard of Pooh Sticks before. And I know, right? Totally in shock. I'm like, how could you survive this long without knowing what Pooh Sticks is? And, that's what I love is the characters and their relationships with each other. And when you see Owl, you're going to get an earful of whatever he feels like talking about at that time. And they each have their own little thing, and that's what I love so much. You're going to get Tigger, and he's going to be bouncy and hyper and going to drive Rabbit crazy, and each one of those characters, that's what I love about it. And maybe it is the prose and the way it's written that makes me love it that much, but I guess I'm pretty character driven when I write my books too, so that's what I pay most attention to.
That's a fascinating. Did you want to go? You're good. I'm a moderator. I shouldn't be interjecting myself in too much.
Go for it.
But something I saw, looking back now at my own children who are now teenagers, when I started reading to them, I think that today they won't sit still for me to read all of Winnie the Pooh to them. But my 20-year-old, 18-year-old, and 16-year-old will sit still for one story or another. And it's as much because of the verbal fun. They'll remind me of when Piglet is in the bag, he's in her pouch. She's helping, and if this is flying, I will never really take to it. And my 20-year-old cracks up when I read that to him. So it.
Well, and you see the other things like heffalumps and woozles, which are just one more example of him playing with words and saying, yeah, this is way more fun to say it this way than the other way.
So for my two cool teenagers, it's a way for it to be okay for them to connect back to this story that they love. I mean, they're going to grow through this and they'll be fine. But right now, they're too cool. So it's a way to let go of the cool.
Mm-hmm.
I'm glad you brought up the Pooh Sticks, because every time, my dad was great for going up in the canyon and having a picnic or something. And if we got anywhere, there was water on a bridge.
Yeah.
We had to get up on that bridge and play poo sticks with my children.
Every
Absolutely.
time.
Absolutely.
You just gotta do it.
Amazed by anyone who didn't.
I know,
Husband
right?
is nuts.
Yes, he is. I'll tell him that.
Explains so much.
It really
It
is.
does. It does explain so much.
He's a really bad husband.
Yes.
No.
Oh, good.
Hobble Creek is really good for that.
Make a
I'm just
note.
saying.
Good to know.
We could always explore other authors that did similar things. You had Curious George, where it was, I can't remember the husband and wife who wrote those.
H.A. and Margaret Ray.
Yeah, and but there you have, even if it's a fantastical story when you look at it, that's actually done really, really well. Had a huge comeback since the movie and the TV series now. That does a lot of the same things with, although he is real and he's a chimpanzee, not a monkey, but has the same effect on children that both Beatrix and Milne had. And that's just an idea.
And I loved Thornton Burgess when I was growing up. I read every single one of his books as a second grader, and they were thick, but I loved his just as much, the same types of stories. And I love Curious George too. And it reminds me of my 4-year-old girl because she's always curious.
I can't really think of anything beyond Milne at this point. But I do like, but just talking about Milne again, how he kind of, I don't know, a gentle way of communicating to us, what it's like to be a child, and coming and kind of stooping down to like a 4-foot level and viewing the world differently and communicating that through his works. I just, how we just adored his son and all the adorable things. I can't get over that.
And some of the way he did that was just by what he chose to emphasize. Poo sticks being a fantastic example. Because to a child, a little game where you drop sticks in a river and then see which one comes out the other side of the bridge first, that's totally worth telling an entire story about. There's no real conflict except which stick's going to come out next. There's no monster in it. There's not like an evil wizard who's trying to steal all the sticks in the 100-acre wood. It's just, I keep thinking about my kids, and for my 6-year-old, he wants adventure and excitement constantly, and my 3-year-old would be totally happy just kind of drilling down and focusing on this one simple thing, because the fact that it is simple does not mean that it's not worth his time. And that's probably why the Christopher Robin poems are split into the 2 parts. Once we were very young, and now we are 6. Because once you hit 6, then we have to start telling more complicated stuff, and we have to start injecting a little more drama into it.
And we learn about factors.
Yes.
Heidi, is there a question on your mind?
One thing is, Peter Rabbit's making a big comeback too. My 3-year-old's in love with Peter Rabbit because there is a show on Nickelodeon. Is it Nickelodeon, right?
Is it?
That's Peter Rabbit, and it's pretty big right now. So it's interesting because Pooh is always, he's been around for quite a while with having Disney picked him up and commercialized him with that. But it's interesting that these stories never go away. And it's interesting how things that we loved as children, kind of, you see them like 20 years later, all of a sudden they're back because we grew up and we want everybody to be into the things we were in. I'm just waiting for like the Dark Crystal to be redone.
Love that one.
Because that was cool.
Speaking of Disney, several years back I went to Disneyland with my kids and they were tiny. And we went on the Winnie the Pooh ride 10 times because there was no line. And so they just let us keep going around. And as I was doing that, it wasn't just me and my kids, it was teenagers too. And it made me think, why do people keep going? And some of it was the bright, happy colors, and then of course the scary where there's the lumps and weasels and stuff. But it brings you back to your childhood, and you want to remember it all over again, no matter how old you are. You get back in there and you're a little kid again, and you're seeing all these things about Winnie the Pooh, and it's exciting. And you know, I think I had just as much fun in there as my little kids did.
Well, when were these published? Was it like
1930-ish?
Yeah, something. Yeah, around then. I mean, and we're still talking about it. So it's really it keeps making, you know, it kind of makes this circle of influencing others. So we're a generation that was influenced when we were young, and now we get to explore, and there's going to be another generation that's going to be influenced by something else, you know? And so it just keeps on circling.
What we need to show them is the original illustrations, not just the Disney
Well,
versions.
and that was like,
I
okay,
love
well, here's
the
Winnie the Pooh,
illustrations.
you know, here's all the Disney stuff, but let me show you what this is. Here, read these stories. This is like the real stuff.
Can we expand on that just a little bit? Because that's a question that fascinates me. Well, do you have a question?
I was going to comment on the illustrations too, and then I just never did. But would you say that that's a contributing factor to like the sentimental and the verbal value even of the stories? And do you think that that's worth keeping? Because the Beatrix Potter, like she did that artwork, all of her artwork for her books, and that was very important to her. She was an artist. Like, how would you take that, I guess, like with your kids watching the show, and it's not the same artwork, probably looks a little different.
Well, they kind of try to mimic it, but yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think that's a good question. I relate really well with that question because I am an author illustrator. I illustrate my own art, of course.
One would
I'm
hope.
tired. I illustrate my own books, and there's something that's kind of cool about that because I think anybody, even if you can't draw, and you just draw a stick figure or whatever, you connect yourself more with that character when you draw it out, and you can tell more. You can tell a different story in your art than what you can tell in words. So you can tell two stories at the same time, and then when you have two stories being told at the same time, when they come together creating one story, you have like a third story, which is the awesome part of the story is. And I think both these authors are great examples of that. I love the old Winnie the Pooh drawings. I think they're just like the classic coolness, and I that's one reason why I connect really well with Beatrix Potter was her art and connecting her stories with the art. And I think it all came from the art. Basically, she created a character and wrote a story from this piece of art that she created.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, is that she wasn't so much illustrating her stories as she was narrating her illustrations.
Yes.
And, you know, I think it is sad, honestly, that that some of that art, you know, that they are using the characters and the stories. But to be fair, you know, they're not using her art, but they're not really using her words either. They're just kind of treating it as an intellectual property and then telling their own stuff.
Because Cotton tells his sister.
And I think that's, you know, that something is getting lost. And, you know, the Beatrix Potter stories are so small. I remember the set we had as kids. They were each in their own tiny little book that was like this big. And I don't know if they do that anymore, or if they're all collected into a huge one, or
I have a set of all individual.
all the little cute ones. I wish
They're
I
about
still
this,
had.
they're about
About
this
this
tall.
big.
They're taller.
Mhm.
And they're
Yeah.
square. And they take about a third of a bookshelf.
See, and as a kid, that was a part of the draw. This is a book that's my size,
Yeah.
and that means a lot to me. So I'm glad they still have those. I need to find some of those.
Dan, let me toss another question at you.
Okay.
You need it. So, react to the same concept, the E.H. Shepard drawings, in the context of the poems. Since you love the poems, and they decorate. I mean, there are Poohs and Christopher Robins and Buckingham Palace Guards and all kinds of things
Mm-hmm.
all through it. And that's a different approach to poetry than we usually see.
Yeah. Well, I think the whole thing is very different. I mean, I don't know who today is producing poetry collections for very young children.
Just Shel
You-
Silverstein.
Yeah, and he does illustrate them all.
Or nursery rhymes are the same way.
Yeah, but those are, nursery rhymes are older that are being recycled and re-illustrated. Someone who is writing something new is probably going to do, and I don't know the market as well for children's books, but at least as a purchasing parent, it seems like children's stuff is all coming in the form of small books or series of small books. And so sitting down with a big collection that has 200 poems in it, I don't know if anyone's doing that these days. And that's sad, because then, it's like the difference between hearing a single on the radio or listening to the entire album. And, okay, so this is a weird tangent, but they just had the Grammys, and Beck won for Best Album, and everyone's like, what? Beck's still recording music? But, the difference is Beck does not put out singles, he puts out albums. And so, there's a narrative arc almost over the course. So you listen to the 10 or 12 songs on there, and you go, okay, these are of a piece, and they're designed to be listened to together. And you get that sense from a poetry collection like the Christopher Robin poems or whatever, that these are all part of a thing, and I can sit down with a big thick book, and it's in little pieces, but they're all part of a cohesive whole that you don't get if you just have, your big stack of, Lightning McQueen and Mater books that my 6-year-old wants me to read all the time.
I did enjoy the illustrations, the original illustrations from Shepard, because it just draws on a specific time, and they're charming. So it helps. It just helped me understand more where he was coming from. Where how Christopher Robin dressed and how he viewed the world was different than nowadays. And I just don't think you can get that same kind of relationship with things like the Mater books that are so commercial nowadays. I just think there's something special about that.
One of the things that stands out to me about the art, thinking back on all of the little sidebar illustrations in the Christopher Robin books, is that the children presented in them are small. Not just that they are young children, but that the illustrations themselves are little. And if you ever get a really big illustration, it's a huge scene with a very small child in it. And there's none of this, big up-in-your-face kind of stuff that we see in so much modern children's illustration, where, the one child... And there's things to be said on both sides. On the one hand, yes, a child's face is absolutely worth giving an entire page to. But then there's this sense of kind of quaintness and charmingness to see, instead of that, a hillside, or even just a blank page, and down in the corner, there's a picture of one little girl, and you don't even see her face. She's just looking down at her shoes. And it gives a very different feel to it.
It's the subtlety.
You've got some sense of that in some of Shel Silverstein's books, because he'll have some little pictures in, amongst the poems.
Definitely. And Jack Perletsky, to a lesser degree, though, he does much bigger illustrations as well.
The thing I like about the old illustrations is, to me, it feels like you're kind of stepping back in time. If you see the old illustrations, you're looking back at it and you're just like, ooh, this is a treasure. Whereas if you see any newer ones, it's not quite the same. You've got the cars and whatever else, and it's all new and it's shiny and it's exciting, but you open these and it takes you back into a whole different world. My daughter loves Little Bear and those illustrations and those stories, and I think it's kind of the same thing. It's the original illustrations that they love, and I think it brings a little innocence and a little magic to it, just to see those original illustrations that aren't super fancy and flashy. It tells the story, and it's very basic.
It's this isn't an art design panel, but one of the things that strikes me too is they're simple. They're line drawings.
Yeah.
And
Not slick.
you fill in And they could do slick at the time. They could do
Yeah.
color printing. They, I don't have it anymore. We had a copy of at the back of the North Wind that had this gorgeous illustration on the front. You could do color plates and all that. They didn't. They did these ones where your imagination fills in the picture based on the words.
Mhm.
I think we're almost out of time.
Yeah.
But I think we'll take a couple of
I thought of
questions.
a question. I was just wondering how, or if at all, these younger these stories inform what you write for older ages.
It's affected my way of constructing poems. So as a fantasy author, I have prophecies and things like that. I mean, that's just, you kind of need it. But it really did help me when, as I was studying poems, how to construct and craft a very elegant poetry so that, it would bring, it would be easy, to say out loud and that it would read well.
I don't write for adults. So I kind of got stuck with the kids.
And I write fairy tales, but they're a little bit older, but I guess, it's the same thing. You take something that you've loved your entire life and you make it your own, and you try to share the magic a little bit more in your own way. And so that's what I see, and like I said, Eeyore will always be one of my favorite ones. You always have to have someone that looks on the other side, and that's.
I will say that how they've influenced me is, we've brought it up before, but they found the magic in the mundane, the simple everyday life, and that's what I like. I love, and when I write my middle grade, which is for older kids, my books are about finding magic in everyday places. My Dreamkeeper Chronicles is all about finding magic in dreams. You go into dreams and when you go to sleep, there's this whole other world that you get to explore. And I love the idea of imagination and play, and that's what I try to bring to my books. And I think all the books that I read as a kid, L. Frank Baum, I would put on this list too, because he was an author that catered to the younger children. And I actually have every single Oz book, which is an original Oz book, that my grandmother gave to me that I got hooked on when I was little. So
The whole room is jealous of you now. Everyone's like plotting to love you in the backyard.
The illustrations in those are awesome. I
Yes.
love the artwork in those. They're beautiful.
Just to repeat what I said earlier, the Christopher Robin poems were a huge influence on my modern writing, partly because that's why I became a writer, because I want to play with words. And, I'm always conscious as I am writing that I'm not just telling a story, but I'm telling it in a certain way, and the words that I pick matter. And it's not enough to just convey the plot, but to actually provide through the language a sense of movement or emotion or whatever. And so it makes it very hard for me to do my copy edits and stuff, because I don't want people to start messing around with my sentences. And that's the most common one I get from a proofreader is, this sentence is like 3 times longer than it should be. I say, well, it's supposed to be that long because that's what makes it work. And you just have to be aware of, how the words fit together. Why use this word instead of that word? And so, he made my job harder, but I love it. That's why I do this.
I think I'd like to just thank our panel.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.